Hello everyone and welcome to our 5th SPRC seminar for 2019. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Bejugal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. So today we have Kate Sollis, who's a Senior Policy and Research Officer at the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, otherwise known as ARACY. She's the lead author of this report. The title is Applying ARACY's NEST Framework to Measure Child Deprivation and Opportunity in Australia. Kate is, I can't remember if I was going to say it or not. Kate has just begun her PhD at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods. The general format for today is about 40 minutes for presentations, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A after. So if you don't mind holding the questions till then, that would be great. And I'd like to introduce, I really stuffed that up. I'm meant to be holding this. Hello. Anyway, too late now. So the roving robot. So if you don't mind, the full session today will be recorded, I think both in the video and audio. Kate will have to hold this wonderful device, and then later on when people ask questions, I'll give you this to speak into, if you don't mind. Yeah. It will also be available as a webinar or an online format later on. Thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Ulisti, and we're really grateful for SPRC for inviting us to present today. It's really exciting to be able to present this work that we've been doing for the past year or so. So broadly what I'll be talking about is, so it's a project we put together to measure child deprivation and opportunity in Australia. So it uses ARACY's NEST framework, which I'll talk about in greater detail, and it applies that to the longitudinal study of Australian children. But before I get into too much detail, I just wanted to firstly recognise the many people that supported us with this project and provided a lot of valuable contributions. That list is quite large. It included a few people from the SPRC, so we're really grateful for that support. In particular, I'd also like to recognise our supporters, UNSW Australia, as well as the Australian Government Department of Social Services for funding this work. So to give a brief outline of the presentation, so firstly I'll talk about the aim and purpose of this research. Before giving sort of a brief overview of the findings, that sort of last slide first, approach before touching on the previous literature, and then going on to the methodology that we applied for this work, and then the key findings. So I'll report that at the national level. So we did analysis on kind of the whole of Australia, and then touched into 3 particular population groups who tend to experience greater life difficulties in Australia. So that's children with disability, children in monetary poverty, and children living in jobless families. I'll then discuss some policy recommendations we put forward given these findings, the limitations of this research as well as further research, and lastly a Q&A. So firstly, our aim and purpose. So initially when we embarked on this work, the key aim and purpose was to develop a tool to measure child wellbeing outcomes in Australia that fit kind of 3 key characteristics. So firstly, one that was child-centric, that allowed for longitudinal analysis, and that was built upon an evidence-based framework. And what we used was ARACY's NEST framework. So before I get into the details, to give kind of a sneak preview of what we found. So in general, children in Australia are doing pretty well. So around 1/4 of all children can be said to have high wellbeing in all NEST dimensions. And I'll talk about how that's kind of measured in a few slides. However, there are a number of issues that need to be addressed. And so particularly what we found, bullying is a big problem in Australia, financial insecurity of households, and nutrition. And some children in Australia are doing it particularly tough. So with children with disability, we found that children with disability tend to be socially excluded, particularly from the school environment, but they tend to be doing relatively well at home where parents have more control over their situation. Children in monetary poverty tend to experience deprivation that spreads far wider than just their material basics. And children in jobless families suffered a greater number of deprivations than all the groups we examined. And this was even when controlling for the fact that children in jobless families are more likely to be living in monetary poverty as well. So to touch on the previous literature on this kind of work. So from the review we did, we kind of broke down, so we wanted to develop a tool to measure child deprivation or well-being. And there are three kind of approaches that have been used internationally in the Australian context that capture this. So first would be the kind of material deprivation. I know it's also used for social exclusion as well, but that sort of material deprivation approach, which can be broadly kind of called the Townsend approach, which has been used a lot here at UNSW. So that essentially comes up with a list of things that children, or it can be applied to adults as well, either do or have, asks them whether they have that, and whether, if they don't have it, whether they need it or want it. So that approach is being used, for example, in the material deprivation and social exclusion report in New South Wales that was done here, and a few other studies in Australia. Another approach that's used quite widely is the multidimensional poverty index, which is put forward mostly by Alkire and Foster, and that essentially breaks kind of multidimensional poverty into key dimensions, selects indicators under each of those dimensions, and then aggregates all that information up into one kind of composite index. So you can use that to rank children from who have the lowest kind of well-being or in the least multidimensional poverty to the most, and you can kind of develop a cutoff point to determine those who are in multidimensional poverty and not in multidimensional poverty. The last approach that's used particularly for children is the UNICEF MODA approach, which stands for the Multiple Overlapping Deprivation approach. It is the approach, the methodology that we decided to take for this project, so I won't discuss that in too much detail now, but just noting that no work has been done in the Australian context using this method. So I've mentioned ARACY's NEST framework a couple of times. So to give you kind of the spiel on this, so in 2012, ARACY conducted a number of consultations with around 3,500 children and young people in Australia, as well as academics, experts in the field, practitioners, on what children in Australia really need to live a good life. And what came out of that is there are 6 key dimensions that children need to be doing well in to live a good life. So they need to be loved and safe, they need to have material basics, they need to be healthy, they need to be learning, participating, and have a positive sense of identity and culture. Even though we present these as 6 kind of discrete dimensions, we acknowledge and we emphasise even that they do overlap and intersect a lot. So obviously aspects of loved and safe impact on how a child learns and how healthy a child is. But this provides kind of a holistic framework of what children themselves say they need to live a good life in Australia. So what we did for this approach is we applied the NEST to the UNICEF MODA methodology. So UNICEF MODA sets itself apart, I suppose, from other measures in 4 ways. So it sees the child as the unit of analysis, so it strongly encourages not taking household information and attributing it to the child, but rather looking at the circumstances specifically of children. Secondly, it acknowledges that the needs of children change over the life course, so indicators to reflect deprivation or wellbeing should change as children get older. Thirdly, it emphasises the importance in assessing the way deprivations overlap, so that again kind of highlights my point previously, and is part of why we chose this approach, because it's important, I guess, in our analysis to acknowledge that they're not kind of concrete, distinct dimensions. And fourthly, it encourages concentrating analysis on highly deprived groups. So I've already touched on why we chose this approach, but also it aligns very well with the NEST, not just in the way that the deprivations overlap, but also the fact that it emphasises being child-centric, and also kind of acknowledging that children's needs change during the life course. And the way while the NEST is applicable to most children, the indicators that sit underneath each of these dimensions will change over time. So in terms of constructing the MODA using the NEST and using our methodology, I've sort of put down a condensed step-by-step list of what we did. So this is taken from de Newburgh and al. in 2012. So this was put forward by the UNICEF Innocenti Research Centre who developed the MODA. The full list is about 26. So I've kind of condensed that down to the key ones that were important for this project. So the first step was to define deprivation and its dimensions. So we do that using the NEST framework. So secondly, for each nest dimension, we need to select a number of indicators to reflect that dimension. Thirdly, specify indicator thresholds. So for each indicator that we select, we need to come up with a cutoff point of whether a child would be flagged as deprived or not deprived. Fourthly, you need to make a decision how to weight indicators and how to aggregate them up into dimensions. Fifthly, decide how to weight dimensions. I don't have a slide on this, but we decided to weight equally. And sixth is decide upon the identification method of whether children are flagged as multidimensionally deprived or not. So for the rest of the methodology section, I'll be going through each of these steps. So we knew we wanted to use the nest as a framework for this, but we then had to, in a way, operationalise the nest to come up with a way of measuring each of these dimensions. I appreciate this slide is not particularly clear. It's more here, I guess, there'll be a clearer slide coming up. But it's useful to present this as the general framework for how we did this research and how we put it all together. So on the side here, we have each of the nest dimensions, so loved and safe, material basics, healthy, learning, and participating. It's worth mentioning now, so there is a sixth nest dimension, positive sense of identity and culture, and we've put that on the side here. And the reason we haven't had that as a separate dimension in itself is because some research that my colleague at ARACY, Lauren Renshaw, is doing, she's done a literature review on ways to measure positive sense of identity and culture. And what she's found is that indicators to measure this sit across all the other nest dimensions. So if we were to adequately compile indicators to measure this dimension, they would have had to be also indicators we used elsewhere. And we didn't want to, I suppose, double count indicators because if, for example, so loved and safe is comprised of relationship with friends, and that also is very important to positive sense of identity and culture. So if we were to use that indicator twice, if a child was deprived in this domain, they would automatically be deprived in that domain. So we have kept it separate, but noting that future research could kind of look at that dimension separately and develop a set of indicators to measure that. So taking sort of a step back from that, so for each nest dimension here, we came up with 4 ideal measures for each dimension that if we were collecting our own data, basically, what would we use to measure the dimension? And to do this, we went back to the NEST consultation document from 2012 and took out the key themes that were highlighted by children under each of these dimensions during those consultations. So, for example, loved and safe is comprised of having good relationship with friends, good relationship with family, being safe at home, and safe at school. And we've done that for each of the nest dimensions. So noting that this is just a framework that we wanted to work with, it's not necessarily what we were able to measure in LSAC. So coming to LSAC, so that is the data source we've used, as I mentioned. So a lot of you may know already, but so LSAC commenced in 2004 with a baby cohort of children aged 0 to 1, and a kindergarten cohort of children aged 4 to 5, and has followed them every 2 years. For this project, we decided to focus on the baby cohort and produced an index essentially for the 3 most recent waves that were available. I know that wave 7 is available now, but wasn't during the time that we were doing this analysis. So that corresponds to children when they were aged 6 to 7 in 2010, 8 to 9 in 2012, and 10 to 11 in 2014.
Sorry, can I just ask one little point of clarification?
Yes.
Are they the same children they're following?
Yes, yeah, exactly the same children. Yeah. So I suppose now we have a framework to work with. We have our list of dimensions. And so the next step was to look at what is available in the LSAC data and map that to the NEST to determine what indicators we can use in LSAC to measure child deprivation according to the NEST. So this was a 3-step process, and we had to have some criteria, I suppose, to exclude or include particular data items. So first of all, what we did is basically looked at the full data item list from LSAC for those 3 waves. Anyone who's used LSAC would know that that's really quite large, so it's about 700 pages long, I think, for each wave. And you would also probably appreciate that almost any data item in LSAC is somewhat related to the NEST. But it was a really important step to take just to, I guess, get a thorough understanding of what exists in the data. So first, there was that mapping approach, and then we had to exclude data items until we came up with a list of 4 that matched the framework that we developed here. So basically we looked for the best indicator that corresponded to relationship with friends, the best indicator that corresponded to relationship with family, and so on. So our criteria, once we had sort of categorised the data items, was that data items needed to be asked of all children or parents in the sample. So this doesn't mean non-response, it means that there are some questions in LSAC that will be asked only of specific children. So for example, if a child has moved house recently or moved school, they'll be asked specific questions related to them changing schools. So that a data item like that wouldn't be used because not all children had a chance to respond to them. Another example is if in single parent families, there's a question on hostility between partners in a family, and obviously that can't be responded to by a single parent household, and so a question like that couldn't be used either. And finally, thirdly, so in LSAC a number of data items are responded to by both children and parents. It could be a similar question, it could also be the exact same question. We made a decision to prioritise responses by children over parents. So for example, there's a strengths and difficulties questionnaire which was answered exactly the same by both parents and children, but we only used the child responses. Just given the nature of MODA and the NES, we wanted the measure to be as child-centric as possible. And it's also worth noting that there are teacher items in LSAC, but we didn't use them because there's quite a low response rate for teachers. So this here shows the exact indicators that we ended up using for this study. So the colour coding represents, the green boxes reflect if an indicator was asked consistently over 3 waves, so exactly the same respondent and exactly the same question. The orange reflects that the questions were asked inconsistently. So in the case of this, frequent bullying and social exclusion, the child was responded to each time, but the question varied slightly, or it could have varied a lot. And for example, in school satisfaction as well. The red boxes, not applicable, show the indicators that we weren't able to come up with any data using LSAC. So what's most notable here is our dimension of participating. We weren't really able to collect a lot of data for the participating dimension. So it was only regular participation in extracurricular activities that we could use an indicator at every wave. There was nothing on sense of belonging for those 3 waves, and nothing about having a say within the community. And there was only one in wave 6, having a say in family decisions. Children were asked about that. So given, I guess, the number of indicators, unfortunately I can't sort of present the exact kind of questioning of all of them, but this kind of gives you a taste of what we were able to measure, and at a broad level kind of what the sort of indicators were. So after coming up with a list of indicators that we could use, we then had to develop thresholds or cutoff points for each indicator to determine whether, or identify whether children were flagged as a deprived or not deprived in those indicators. So again, this was a step-by-step process. So firstly, if the literature indicated a sensible cutoff point, we used that. So I've already mentioned the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, which is a well-established scale that's used in LSAC, and there are well-used cutoff points for that. They already exist, so we decided to go with them. In the case that there was nothing in the literature that suggested a good cutoff point, we had to develop our own, essentially. So in the case of frequency questions, a regularity of a negative behaviour or a construct resulted in deprivation. So for example, we have an indicator on yelling at the home, which reflects the safe at home kind of measure. And if a child reported either often or always they experienced yelling at the home, then they were flagged as deprived, and not if they answered anything else. It could also be a more specific frequency. So for example, in the bullying question, they're asked how often they're bullied, and we went with if they're bullied at least once a week, then they're flagged as deprived. And finally, we used a number of scales for indicators. So essentially, scales are kind of a collection of indicators that go together to measure a construct. And so it was important, I suppose, not to just cherry pick which specific indicators within the scale we wanted to use. They come as a set, so it's important to use them as a set. So how we did this is basically we calculated a mean for each child on that scale. So for example, if a scale consisted of 5 questions, maybe 1 being always, 2 being sometimes, and 3 being never, we would kind of give each a number. So 1 would correspond with always, 2 sometimes, and 3 never. And then we would calculate the mean for what that, on average, what that child reported. And the cutoff point would be the midpoint of that scale. So if, say in the case of bullying, so if the options were always, sometimes, or never, the cutoff point would be 2. So if a child on average got a score of between 1 and 2, they'd be flagged as deprived, and if the average was between 2 and 3, it was not deprived. So it's kind of on average they reported that they were bullied. So finally, so we have a list of dimensions, indicators, cutoff points. So then the final step was to develop an approach to identify deprivation. So we decided to go with a union approach, and what that means is if a child is flagged in any indicator within a dimension, they're flagged as deprived in that dimension. So in this example, so if a child got a flag for being deprived in relationship with friends, they would subsequently get a flag for being deprived in loved and safe. So it's a good measure to assess prevalence, but not necessarily depth. Because if a child had a flag for each indicator, it would essentially look the same as the child who was deprived in only one indicator. But we developed another measure to overcome that. And I'll talk about that in a second. But firstly, multi-dimensional deprivation. So children who are flagged as multidimensionally deprived were deprived in 3 or more dimensions. And lastly, deep deprivation, which is what I just mentioned. So that aims to measure more severity of deprivation within one dimension. So a child was considered deeply deprived if they were deprived in 2 or more indicators within a dimension. So in this example, they threw up a flag for financial security and adequate food and shelter. So then they would be considered deeply deprived in material basics. And the same in this situation. So that gives a kind of taste of what our overall methodology was. If you want more information, I'd encourage you to look at the full paper, which is online. So to go to the results that we found. So what this table shows is the percentage of children who were considered deprived on each indicator. And red denotes a deprivation rate of greater than 15%, orange 5 to 15, and green 0 to 5. So what this table highlights is that there are a clear number of issues in terms of prevalence of deprivation. So frequent bullying or social exclusion is as high as 28% in wave 5 when the children were aged 8 to 9, but it's still at about 20% at the other waves. Financial security of family, so that's measured by whether parents had issues paying for bills or groceries and things like that. So that sits at about 20% at each wave. And adequate fruit and vegetables, so that's sort of measuring nutrition. So that was at about 20% of children were deprived on that measure for age 6 to 7 and 8 to 9, and then that jumped up to 26% at wave 6. It's important when looking at these results to also keep in mind the table I presented before that showed whether these measures were measured consistently over time. So for example, in the case of nutrition, in wave 4 and 5 it was responded to by the parent, and then in wave 6 it was responded to by the child. So because it wasn't measured quite consistently, we can't be certain that this is really truly a big jump, or whether it's maybe the fact that children tend to respond to that question differently than their parents. However, in light of those more worrying findings, this research also did show some really positive things. So for example, children have really good opportunities through their relationship with parents. 3.5% were considered deprived in wave 4 and only 1.1% in wave 5. Also, not to, I suppose, underemphasize the severity and the issues of not having a place to live, but the vast majority of children in Australia do have a stable place to live, and participation in cultural activities is also a very low deprivation rate. So children have good opportunities to learn out in their community. So what this shows now is the deprivation rate by each dimension. So again, that's aggregated up into the dimension by using that union approach. So if a child was flagged as deprived in, loved and safe, they were deprived in at least one indicator, 1, 2, 3 or 4. So we can see here that loved and safe tends to have the highest deprivation rate, and that's again caused by bullying and social exclusion largely, and that's also why we experience a big jump, because we also saw a big jump for bullying and social exclusion between wave 4 and wave 5. We can see that material basics is relatively stable over time, so it was sitting, the deprivation rate was sitting at about 29% in wave 4, and then went down to about 25% for wave 5 and 6. And that's predominantly driven by financial insecurity. We can see healthy is at about 1/3 at wave 4 and 5, and jumps up to about 40% being deprived in wave 6, and that's largely through nutrition. And again, we saw that big jump with nutrition. Learning outcomes tend to improve over time. So we have 37% being deprived in this dimension at wave 4, and that's down to 27% by wave 6. And that's largely driven by improvements we saw in school satisfaction. However, noting that the scale we used for that indicator did change at each wave. So we can't be certain that school satisfaction did indeed improve over time. Our indications are that it might have, but it would be worth some more research. Finally, we can see the participating deprivation rate is much lower compared to the others, and that's largely a factor of there being fewer indicators available for this dimension. So that's a big limitation of the union approach, because if there's only, in the case of wave 4, there was only one indicator that we used in participating. And so obviously if there were 4 available, loved and safe, so obviously there's much more opportunity, I suppose, for a child to be deprived in a dimension when there are 4 indicators that are being used to measure it, as opposed to participating when there was only 1. So now to talk about the experience of multidimensional deprivation. So this slide shows the distribution of number of deprived dimensions at each wave. So the blue bars reflect no deprived dimensions, green 1, light purple 2, dark purple 3, and so on. So we can see here that the distributions look pretty similar for the 3 waves. And we can also see that at each wave, around 25% of children are doing well in absolutely every indicator we measured. In terms of multidimensional deprivation, so that's being deprived in 3 or more dimensions, that's this group here. And it was pretty much exactly at 20% of each cohort at each wave. It's worth mentioning that for the children who were multidimensionally deprived, they tended to have the minimum number of deprivations. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the number of indicators these children were deprived in, the vast majority were deprived in only 3 indicators. And that's the very minimum that a child could be deprived in for this measure, and it would have been 3 separate dimensions. So given this, it shows that even though these children are experiencing difficulties on a number of fronts, they have other resources through the nest that they can rely on to overcome these issues. So even though they might be deprived in bullying and social exclusion, perhaps they have a really good relationship with their friends and families that can help overcome this. And now to talk about the experience of deep deprivation. So we can see here that the vast majority of children were not deeply deprived in any dimension. So the blue bars show 0 deep deprivations. And so that's set at 85% in wave 4 and 76 and 75% at wave 5 and 6. We can see then that the vast majority of children who did have a deep deprivation had only 1. Again, this emphasises that even though these children are experiencing some issues on certain fronts, they do have other resources that they can draw on. And this shows the experience of deep deprivation by nest dimension and wave. So we can see that the vast majority of children who have a deep deprivation experience it in loved and safe in wave 5 and 6. And this sort of big jump was largely caused by the inclusion of frequent yelling in the home, which was used to measure safe at home. So that had high co-occurrence with bullying and social exclusion. And it also had high co-occurrence with a relationship with friends. So that's why we see that big jump. For the rest of the dimensions, it's relatively lower. So these were the results at a high level for the national level. And so now I will go into the analysis we conducted for 3 particular population groups. So that was children with disability, children in monetary poverty, and children in jobless families. So I'll just explain this table briefly. So this shows each indicator and essentially whether this group were significantly more deprived compared to their peers on each indicator. So the red illustrates that children with disability were more likely to be deprived than their peers, orange if there was no significant difference, and green if children with disability were less likely to be deprived compared to their peers. The boxes, the shading of the boxes illustrate the significance level and they just correspond to the star level here. So 1 star is significant at the 10% level, 2 stars significant at the 5% level, and 3 significant at the 1% level. So as we can see here, there are some indicators that illustrate children with disability experience greater levels of deprivation compared to their peers. So this is frequent bullying and social exclusion at wave 5 and 6 when children were between 8 and 11, relationship with friends, financial security of the family for all waves, mental health from age 8 to 11, school attendance, learning at home. So what we sort of summarise from these results is the things that parents have a lot of control over, children with disability are doing pretty well in. So they have good food security, they have a place to live, so they've got good nutrition, they're learning at home for most waves, they have good opportunities there, they're participating in cultural activities, they've got, again, a good relationship with their parents. But then as soon as children with disabilities step out into the school environment, they're more likely to suffer from bullying and social exclusion, their mental health outcomes are worse. Financial security of the family could be due to the fact that parents may have to take time off work to take more care of their kids if they're not able to use kind of mainstream school services and things like that. So yeah, essentially things that are out of control of the parents, children with disability tend to have worse outcomes in.
Could you just clarify the significance of different percentage levels?
Yeah, so 1 star is 10%.
So what do you mean, is there a 10% difference?
Oh, sorry, they're significantly different at the 10% significance level. Right. So the more stars, the more certain we can be that they're truly different. So I would say for the indicators with either 3 or 2 stars, where we can be very certain that they're different. For 1 star, we can maybe not be, yeah, perhaps, but also maybe not. For the dash, we can say that from the data we have, we can't say there's a significant difference between the two groups. So to look at children in monetary poverty, and again, this slide is quite worrying. We see a lot of red here and a lot of 3 stars. So what we found here is that it's not just material basics that children in monetary poverty are experiencing worse outcomes, it's across the board. It hits every dimension. So we're seeing children with monetary poverty have significantly worse relationship with their friends. They're more likely to experience, their families are more likely to experience financial insecurity as we would expect being in poverty, lower food security, they're more likely to be homeless in the past 2 years, they're not getting good nutrition, their mental health outcomes are worse, they're less likely to attend school. So a lot of these things, for example, they're less likely to participate in extracurricular activities, which has been found in other research that potentially caused by the fact that children in poverty tend to move so much. So they're not able to kind of establish a base for themselves, they're not able to participate in activities, that might be also affect their school attendance. So we can see here that being in poverty has widespread implications for the rest of the NEST domains. And finally, children in jobless families. So we can sort of see a similar pattern to the previous slide. We found that, so this analysis isn't presented in the presentation, but we found that even when controlling for the fact that children in jobless families are going to be more likely to be in poverty, they're still more likely to suffer worse outcomes on some indicators. So that includes relationship with friends, bullying and social exclusion, homelessness, mental health, and participation in extracurricular activities. So based on all those findings, we put together a number of policy recommendations to help, to help provide a start to addressing some of the concerns. We don't anticipate that these policy recommendations will solve all the problems, but they provide a good starting base to do this. So these recommendations were put together from the literature, but also through consultations with a number of experts. So firstly, a fair go to all kids, so increase income assistance to low-income families. So this is the finding that children in monetary poverty were significantly more likely to experience adverse outcomes, and also the rate of financial insecurity was quite high at about 20%. Healthy bodies, so introduce regulation to reduce the amount of unhealthy food marketing reaching children. It's a largely unregulated system, and so we think this could go some way to improving the nutrition rates that we saw. Safe at school, so introduce evidence-based anti-bullying programs in all Australian schools to address the high rates of bullying and social exclusion. Healthy minds, so prioritise preventative and early intervention programs to improve the mental health of Australia's infants and children. So this is to address, we saw even from age 6 that a large portion of Australian children were more likely to experience negative mental health outcomes. So by putting more investment in prevention and ensuring that children are healthy from a very young age, we think would have flow-on effects by the time they reach 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Widen the school gates, so establish a more inclusive education system with adequate resourcing. So this addresses the issue of children with disability and the social exclusion they seem to experience outside of the home. And this is more about mainstreaming children with disability into the mainstream education system, given that research has shown that children with disability experience significantly better outcomes if they are included in mainstream education, and also their peers are as well. And finally, get to know our kids better through better data on children to guide better policy. So we have 3 recommendations within this. So firstly is to implement a repeated cross-sectional study of children and young people in Australia. We note that this doesn't exist now. We do have some very good standalone cross-sectional data sets, for example, the Australian Child Wellbeing Project, but it's really important to have those continually running so we can measure progress over time. Secondly is to implement a new birth cohort study. So I've talked about LSAC a lot in this presentation, and there's also the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. And while that's an incredibly useful data source, and that data should continue to be collected as the children grow into adulthood, they almost are adults now. So at the latest wave, I think they were 16, 17. So we need to implement a new study so we can look at how a new cohort of children are growing up. And research has shown that should be done every 12 to 15 years. And finally, we recommend that there should be, that LSAC should review the alignment of their data to the NEST, because we did find that there are a number of gaps. So to briefly talk about limitations, so I've already touched on a few of these. So firstly, there was exclusion of some aspects of wellbeing raised during NEST consultations, and that's essentially the issue of we had to draw upon all this data and develop 4 measures under each NEST dimension. So for example, health insurance was brought up as an important factor. However, we didn't include that as we thought it was sort of covered through financial security and that kind of thing. But ideally, it would have been nice, I suppose, to include that, but it was important to have a consistent number of indicators for each dimension. Secondly, data limitations. So that's simply the fact that LSAC didn't have absolutely everything we would have liked to measure ideally. Third was non-response in data items. So I didn't touch on this, but in LSAC, not every child will respond and not every parent will respond to absolutely every question. There will be non-response. And so in those cases, if a child didn't respond to a particular indicator that we used, we automatically flag them as not deprived. So that means that our estimates of deprivation are downward biased. They're conservative estimates. They're likely to be higher. Fourth is varying indicator strength. So given that we didn't have control over what indicators we used, we were using existing data. Some indicators are stronger and more relevant than others. And finally, there were restrictions in developing cutoff points for certain indicators. So what I mean by this is that, for example, in our nutrition question, the question that was asked in LSAC is, did you have fruit and or vegetables yesterday? So a child was flagged as deprived in this if they didn't have fruit or vegetables, but it didn't take into account serving size. So we know there are a number of guidelines on how many servings of fruit and vegetables a child needs. We weren't able to take that into account in our research. So actually the nutrition rates that I presented before are likely to be much, much lower than what they actually are if you took into account serving sizes. And finally, further research. So this project was essentially just meant to sort of be a beginning of developing a measure that we could use in future to measure child deprivation and opportunity. So, and it wasn't really done longitudinally. It was 3 cross-sectional snapshots over time. So in future, it would be really useful to examine the persistence of deprivation over time using this measure. I understand from previous research that it's shown that children tend to not be stuck in one, they tend to sort of come in and out of it. It would be interesting to see what the case is using this measure. Assessing the impact of disadvantage in the early years on later deprivation and opportunity. So we can look at the situation children were in when they were 0 to 1, 2 to 3, and see what their outcomes were when they were 12 to 13, for example. We can look at other population groups. So we specifically examined children with disability, children in monetary poverty, and children in jobless families, but we could look at other breakdowns such as gender, family type, out-of-home care, children in single-parent families, obviously keeping in mind sample size as well. We could update the index. So I noted that the latest Wave of the Bee cohort came out recently, so we could add an amendment to the research and compile an index for children when they're aged 12 to 13 and see if anything's changed. We could do the same thing for the kindergarten cohort. And as I mentioned before, we could also develop a similar index to measure positive sense of identity and culture, which we weren't able to include in this one. So thanks everyone for your time. I've put up a couple of email addresses. So you can contact ARACY at inquiries@aracy.org.au. I'm very sad to say that this is actually my last week at ARACY, but I'll continue to be working really closely with the organisation. But if you want to get in touch with me specifically about this particular research, you can get in touch with me on my ANU account. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was very, very impressive. I'm sure there's lots of questions, so put your hand up and I'll give you the mic. Jen?
That was a great presentation, Kate. Thank you so much for that. And it's really lovely to see the NEST framework being used as a framework for research and applied to what is our best child data set in Australia. But I do have some questions about that best data set.
Yep.
I'm curious about how many and what the kind of response rate is and the setting where children are reporting. So are they reporting with an adult with them? Is that adult a member of their family?
Yep.
Or are they reporting in schools? I think they're reporting in the home. But if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I think that tells us something. Every data set has a bias, but it's really good to understand what that bias is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So for LSAC, from what I understand, the mode for which a child will respond depends on the module. So some will be done via internet. I think these days most of them, but they also change by wave. Obviously, as technology improved during the waves, the mode went more towards the internet. It's quite possible that a parent was looking over their shoulder. I suppose there's no way that LSAC can monitor that. I do believe there's some questions, there were some face-to-face interviews. So I guess given, there was very varied modes, I suppose, in which LSAC used to ask these questions of children. I'd have to look at the exact questions, but it's something I haven't touched on, but it'd be really interesting to look into.
So in terms of understanding how many children might be homeless in an ABS definition, is it likely that they're answering the LSAC survey during periods of homelessness?
Quite possibly not, because they'd be very hard to reach. Yeah.
Bruce, you know Bruce? Homelessness, children answering LSAC in the context of homelessness. Anything else?
Yeah. I mean, the question on homelessness in the data set is whether you haven't had a place to live in the past 2 years. So it's different from the census, which is this night. It's in the past 2 years, have you had it? So I suspect that LSAC would have a very hard time tracking a child who was homeless, and that they would be very much underrepresented in the data.
Thank you, Kate, and it was a great presentation. A lot of work's gone into it, clearly. My question's sort of along the same lines as the previous one. So talking about, you used a sort of survey data set and you wanted to focus on the child level to get a multidimensional sort of indicator. Why not go bigger? So like the multidimensional poverty index doesn't use individual level data, but it uses sort of larger national or state level data sets that have less missing data or sort of less ability to be, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but like potential biases in there. How come you went for a individual rather than sort of that larger level?
Rather than that household level?
Yeah.
It's simply because the measure that we wanted to come up with, we wanted it to be child-centric. So a lot of research previously on things like poverty and multidimensional poverty, they've attributed the situation of the child to the situation of the household. And that's, I mean, given the distribution of resources within a household might be different, it's hard to make inferences on children based on that. But also we're not able to examine the specific circumstances of children, like are they being bullied? Are they experiencing frequent yelling in the home? So I suppose because the nest emphasises the importance of capturing all that information, having household level data just wouldn't be adequate for it.
Cheers, Kate. I'm curious about how you account for, or did you need to account for the ease in for a child to self-identify in the different areas? Just like I imagine it's easier for a child to be able to say yes or no, do you have $100? But to ask them the question, do you feel loved, might be objectively much more challenging.
Yeah, so I can go back to sort of the indicators we used. So I can just use this slide. So for example, I mean, loved and safe, it wasn't asking children, do you feel loved and safe? I guess it was using indicators to give an illustration of whether they are or not. So for example, relationship with friends used a scale called the peer problem scale in the social strengths and difficulties